Welcome to the Contrarian Capitalist podcast. I'm delighted to be joined today by Paul from the Sirius report. Paul, hello, how are you?
Well, first, yeah, I'm very well, and thank you, obviously, for asking for me to come on. It's a pleasure to be here, and hopefully, we can have an interesting discussion that will give people some enlightenment about things they may not be aware of.
A lot to talk about. I always seem to say that to every guest, but a lot to talk about. And I think that what we might end up doing, because there is so much to talk about, is we might split this down. So we'll probably look at more of a geopolitical approach, like a very large macroeconomic geopolitical approach in this recording. And then we'll probably split it down and we'll get you back on and then go into other subject matters in a different episode. Uh, But all of that being said, I'm sure most people are familiar with yourself and the Sirius report. And we were saying off air that, yourselves laid out some ideas, 10 or 15 years ago, and you could see things coming down the road. These things are now here. So if you don't mind, start anywhere you want. What sort of things were you saying, and what was the reasoning behind that? And do you feel any better for the fact that those things have come to fruition?
Well, to be honest, there is a backstory. I have said it at times before, but it's worth reiterating. I obviously had the pleasure to know a group of people, and particularly one person who's sadly not with us anymore. He passed away a few years ago. And they were what I would call the true architects of, forget, I don't like this term reset or monetary reset or whatever, what I would call the true architects of multipolarity, in that they had a vision back in the late 1990s, and they basically went and said to the West, for example, look, financialization is doomed. Eventually, the wheels are all going to fall off, and the Western financial system will blow up, and this is not sustainable. And they predicted what would happen in a very broad sense, and their belief was that people needed to be invested in gold and silver. And I got to know one of them in sort of 2010. And we had a lot of discussions, and he told me about the fact the West ignored them, didn't believe it, said, "Don't be ridiculous. We're the West, particularly the United States and Britain." But the Chinese, the Russians bought into it and accepted that, this made sense because they laid out all the reasons in detail why economically, financially, it was unsustainable, which it is because if you don't have an economy that actually produces anything, but you have an economy that depends on this trickle down economics that says we create all these ever growing asset bubbles, and some of that equates to wealth, and that wealth will filter down to the real economy is ridiculous. Hence, this ridiculous consumption model that doesn't work. You have to, in the end, produce something and then sell it to domestically or to the world. Otherwise, your economy is doomed. So, obviously, when I got to know them, we had, particularly this one person, we had long discussions about things. We sort of talked about, for me working in the financial sector, and this was obviously post 2008. And for me, in 2006, I knew 2008 was coming. I didn't know it was 2008, but no one would listen. But it was obvious that we were going to have a financial crisis. And it just sort of resonated, and we chewed things over and talked about things, and he mentioned a lot of things that were in the pipeline at that point in time that were going to come in over a great number of years. So, not least big developments in China, what was going to happen in the relationship between China and Russia. So, for example, there was going to be a massive energy deal between the two countries, which came about in 2014, the Power of Siberia 1 gas pipeline that would all be traded in non-dollar terms, and how, in a broad sense, de-dollarisation was going to come in, and you would start to see evidence of that, and really a big change in the world order that meant, this concept of multipolarity was going to come to pass, and you'd see relationships develop between countries that would surprise you. But this, for example, back in sort of 2015, 2016 time, we were having a conversation. And I said, well, I'm starting to see evidence. I think we'll see rapprochement between the Saudis and the Iranians, which no one would have believed. And he said, yeah, we think so too. And of course, we talked about it, and people went, no, no. And then, of course, it happened. So it's really talking about what the Belt and Road Initiative was going to do, where it was going to build out across what you can call the global south. And so we started documenting developments that were happening in Asia, in Africa, etc. And really just talking about those little small things that people felt were insignificant, or this means nothing, but they were huge in the context of what was coming. So there was, even back in 2016, for example, clear evidence of this rapprochement in energy terms between the Saudis and the Russians, who would join as OPEC plus, and this would gradually put the squeeze on the US's role and vis-a-vis what happened with the petrodollar, but also, of course, the role of China and the petro yuan, and how a few years after that I found buried amongst Saudi Aramco's balance sheet clear evidence of a little bit of trading in oil with China in the petro yuan. And therefore, these kind of small developments that have huge consequences, and the role, of course, that Iran would play in the future, and how there was this unbreakable bond between China and Russia that nobody in the West literally would believe. I think a lot of people think differently now. So it was those kind of discussions, starting then taking them on and having a kind of very different perspective on how you perceive the world. So it was starting to go, well, I'm interested in, and I knew the demise of the West was coming anyway, economically, financially, politically, etc. But I started to pay a lot more attention to what was happening in what I call West Asia, not the Middle East, and what was going on in Central Asia and Southeast Asia. And these enormous trade blocks that were growing and developing, and how China was starting to change its economy and rotate its economy and move gradually out of being basically the country that everyone associated with. They all manufactured cheap goods and export them to the rest of the world. They were starting to change that and become more high tech, and start to obviously become more consumption based, and how they were evolving. Their financial system was very closed, and obviously meant in 2008 they survived without a scratch on their knee. Even it didn't affect them. And of course, they bailed out the West and the United States, which a lot of people don't understand. That's what happened. So it was just building up this general understanding and starting to see the world in a different light, and then just carrying that forward and focusing on what was really happening. And the person obviously I dealt with principally, I say, not about 3 or 4 weeks before he passed away, he was going, I'm starting to get too old for all this, and you've learned a lot and understanding, and in a way, it's kind of time to pass the baton on to you more, and you know what's going on, and please continue telling the world all these developments, because it's important that people in the West understand the gravity and significance of it, because it's way bigger than just finance, economics. It's just basically a whole different way of conducting business and just behaving. Win-win cooperation is the future, not this sort of US hegemonic attitude and this zero-sum game mentality, and creating these blocks that were there to be adversaries with other perceived blocks or just individual countries. And over the period of time since I first became aware of it, there are hundreds of developments. And over a period since 2016, we had the subscription podcast series, which is audio. Originally, now we do some truncated versions in written form, but there is, I think today I recorded episode 2311 and 2312,
Wow.
and it documents all these things over years, and they're all buried in there at different times. And It's just, in essence, seeing things. And I'll give one example of this where in 2018, March 2018, Putin did this speech to the Russian Duma. And I said at the time it was probably the biggest development in 1,000 years of human history. And reason is because he laid out all Russia's military technology we still don't have in the West, that gives them this enormous advantage militarily. And I said that will be the biggest game changer because the United States will now have to think very differently how it conducts itself on a world stage. And also it will dramatically change the perspective of what NATO will be in the future, etc., etc. And I think that's panned out. Okay, we've had the Ukraine war, but in essence, the Ukraine war, and I said at the time in 2014 when they had the Maidan, in the end, this will be the death of US hegemony. It will all play out a certain way. The perception was maybe at some point there might be a war. There was no indication categorically that would happen. But my feeling was this is the end. And I think very clearly, since the Ukraine war started, the huge acceleration of the demise of the US dollar as a world reserve currency and as a reserve asset in US Treasury form is very clear. And it's being increasingly replaced by gold as we're seeing that all over the world, or certainly the global south countries. So it was really just that kind of understanding and taking that forward and still seeing very significant things that may not mean an awful lot, but they have huge broader implications because the world is massively changing. Hence, Saudi and Pakistan signing basically a NATO Article 5 type military agreement, which means an attack on one is an attack on both. And Pakistan has nuclear weapons. You have to start taking these things seriously in that region. And there's dozens of other big changes that have come about, or hundreds of them, and they are all equally important for different reasons. And I think it's important to understand as many as you can because it paints this really interesting picture where you start off with little bits of a puzzle and you pick them all, and then eventually bits of the puzzle join together, and then the puzzle gets bigger.
Mm.
And we're now, well, for me, I can see the picture in totality, but that's over a period of a decade, and spending quite a lot of time doing this, and on a not on a day-to-day basis, within reason, of course, not exactly, but we do put a lot of time and effort in to look at developments that we feel have huge significance. And then you start to see announcements coming out that still don't necessarily resonate with people, but that's part of building this puzzle out. So there's something going on, for example, in the Russian Far East, which many people don't talk about, don't even know about, but is one of the biggest developments that will ever happen in human history. And that ties in not with just Russia, but its relationship with China and how it builds out what's going to happen in Southeast Asia and why the Ukraine war is a disaster for the Europeans particularly, because they've turned their back on cheap Russian energy.
Hmm.
And the major beneficiaries are going to be, guess who? The Southeast Asia and probably ultimately other parts of the global south who have a big thirst for energy in the future. And the West, or particularly Europe's going to sit there and go, but hang on a minute, what are we going to do? Because we're just dependent on ridiculously expensive US energy, which is not going to last forever ever either, because US shale oil and gas is in decline. Hence why the United States is suddenly very interested in parts of the world where they have huge energy reserves, and they may be interested in seeing a different leader in power. So, for example, Venezuela is again back in the news for that very reason.
A lot to uncover there. I think that it reminds me of a Chinese proverb, and I think it's a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. And what I'm trying to relate to that is that through your readings and understanding of little events, dare I say, years and years ago, they have snowballed into where we are today. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. You mentioned about what's going on in the Far East of Russia. That's news to me, and I'm sure it's going to be news to quite a few people listening to this. I think it's also important to say, Paul, uh, to add extra perspective to this, is that you have in your lifetime through your work and everything, you have had significant experience in both Russia and China itself. So this isn't just let's sit here in the West and let's talk about these things. You have hands-on experience with these countries as well. I just want to lay that down for people listening to this. So if you can, step by step, if you want to, of course, let's go to this significant development in the Far East of Russia, and let's have a look at these um, Russian and Chinese relations and the significance that that relationship has had and will continue to have on the world.
Well, yeah, I mean, the relationship is unique because the relationship between Xi and Putin is pretty much something I've never seen in my life. I always say they're like brothers, how they are together, and they literally are. There's a bond between them that's extremely strong, and it's more that way inclined. And the Russians and the Chinese, in terms of foreign policy, discuss everything with each other, what they're doing. So you often see, for example, Russia will make some moves in like the Sahel region, which was to militarily secure countries like Niger, for example, or Burkina Faso, etc. And but you'll see China in there economically. They do work in tandem. They obviously work in tandem in terms of all the trade and development between the two countries. So we talked about the Power of Siberia 1 pipeline, the Power of Siberia 2 pipelines now being signed off, which will probably double the capacity in excess of 100 billion cubic meters a year. But there's going to be more projects coming online. And the simple fact is that if you look at the example of the Russian Far East, anyone who looks on it geographically, it's very underdeveloped, but Russia has enormous resources it's never tapped. I would arguably say they've only ever really tapped 30% or even less of their resource. Their resource base is so enormous, it's mind-blowing.
Mm,
They probably have at least, and this is what they could power the entire world for with oil and gas. They're not going to, but they could for 250 years minimum. But they have all these untapped resources which exist in places like the Russian Far East. Russian Far East shares a border with China, but also it's a gateway to the rest of Southeast Asia, and therefore on that basis there are plans to have massive developments there, which is going to require cities to be built, infrastructure to be built. It's going to have to be paid for, and China's going to invest hugely. So whereas China has been asked by the United States to please buy $500 billion of our US treasuries on multiple occasions in the last 2 or 3 years and been told politely to go away. Where do you think they're going to invest the 500 billion?
mm,
In Russia, for example. So
mm,
they will build out this region. They will look to exploit all the commodity base they have there, the energy, additional energy that can be brought online. You can put extra pipelines in, but also, of course, the Russian Far East has, obviously, if you look at it geographically, it has borders with what then transpires into the Northern Sea route. Now, I've just
mm,
done my something I put out on YouTube, which will go out later on today in terms of the time we're recording this now, which talks about how that's going to become the biggest trade route, arguably, or a massive trade route globally, and it will be utilized not just by Russia and China, but by countries all over Eurasia. And if you build out that region and start putting ports in, then you're going to need railways to service those ports. And where do those railways go and where do they link up? And do they hook up with the north-south transport corridor that ends up in Iran? And there's a whole backstory why there's endless attempts to have color revolutions in Georgia, because Georgia's the route through which the north-south corridor will transverse into Iran. So the West doesn't want that to happen because they
Mhm.
want to cut off Iran as much as possible. So you start to build this picture of this huge development. And so it's going to need all this infrastructure to be built. You're going to need the resources to build it. And everybody's finally in the global south gone, if we're going to build the future, if we're going to have this massive, big paradigm shift globally, we're going to need access to enormous amounts of resources. Who's got them? The Russians have got them. And also big technological developments. They'll build big technology centers. And And therefore, this is why Russia is very keen to see its population grow hugely. It's also keen on having people in immigration terms who can come in and go, well, what can you offer this country? Do you have skills? Are you kind of STEM graduates, for example? Science, technology, engineering, maths. And there's a big push for that. And this is a project, it's far bigger than a project, but let's call it that, which will last for decades. But eventually you will build all of Siberia out and northern Siberia, even northern Siberia, because we have technology now where we can do things we couldn't previously do, like icebreaker technology. And yeah, I'm not the big fan of the whole global warming stuff, but certainly that route is you can transverse it a lot easier. But with these icebreakers the Russians have got, you can get through it significantly most of the year. And there's belief in the future increasingly through the whole of the year. And this year, I think there's going to be about 450,000 tons of cargo transported through the Northern Sea route. Why use it? You don't have to go through the Suez Canal. That's a geopolitical potential hot potato. But
Mhm.
also, the transportation time's half the time, much cheaper. And this can then, if you start to build out this whole region, then it's going to serve the whole of Eurasia. Eventually, maybe Europe, and we'll get on board when it wakes up to reality, but we're some way off that at the moment. But you get the understanding why something like that is hugely significant. And there's been many developments already, and that is going to be a massive project that will benefit the Chinese and the Russians because China will put lots of tech there. They'll have lots of businesses there, but also it will benefit the broader Eurasia is so central. Asia, for example, and why there's massive developments going on there. And also, of course, Southeast Asia, so for example, or the ASEAN countries. And that's how you start to build this picture of seeing little pieces and putting it together. So, in a broader sense, for China and Russia, there's no doubt China hasn't helped them militarily, but they've helped them financially too. They buy enormous amounts of energy, and they bought huge amounts of energy and then sold it on. So there's a kind of weird irony that Europe sat there going, "Well, we've cut ourselves off from Russian pipeline gas. Yeah, do you know what you're doing, Europe? You're now buying Russian LNG via the Chinese. And it goes all the way around the world, costs 5 times as much, and they all slap each other on the back and go, look, we've stuck it to the Russians, and the Russians are getting more money out of it than they would with pipeline gas. But in the end, the Europeans pay an awful lot more because of the transportation. Then that ironically doesn't go around the Northern Sea route, but has to go all the way around via Malacca Strait and then through the Suez Canal. And that's one of those bitter ironies that people in the West don't understand. But that's a reality. So the relationship is just constantly how can we work together? What can we do technologically together? What resources do each of us have? How can we mutually help each other? All done under the guise of de-dollarisation, all under the guise of the fact that both of them understand, as we're coming back to the original story, that you want to get out of SWIFT, you want to get out of dollar denominated assets, you just want to have nothing to do with the Western financial system because it's going to collapse. And this time it's an everything problem. It's not a subprime problem. It's an because look at how much we've printed. And we printed, well, the United States has printed way more than conventional wisdom understands. So there was someone who did forensic examination. They thought it was 21 trillion missing on the US balance sheet. Then it was 100 trillion. It could be 200 trillion, which is just basically money that's being printed. And there was someone who recently alluded to the magic money machines in the US Treasury that just seem to print when there's a requirement for it. I mean, just a simple example. The US has gone in because they're terrified the Chinese will go in and muster some kind of control over Milei in Argentina. So they came up with 20 billion. No one asked the question where did the 20 billion come from?
Mm,
It came from they just printed it out magically out of thin air. It doesn't exist, but it's just because we don't want China there. But of course, in doing all this, they've massively undermined the dollar and undermined the belief that US Treasury is a safe haven, as we said previously. So when you understand, and not just the Russian and China, but all the global South countries, that the Western financial system and the thing that underpin the world, being the US dollar, is over, then they're going to start obviously looking at alternatives and finding different payment systems and trading in local currencies and getting out the dollar because they've realized how massively beneficial it is. And not least because they can't be sanctioned anymore or threatened with sanctions. And of course, it's more cost effective than actually utilizing the dollar because a lot of their currencies were attacked to weaken
mm,
them. So they then would have to go to the IMF with a begging bowl and get more dollars and hook them into the system. And so they couldn't get out. Now we've noticed in recent years how many global South countries who, when the US raised interest rates, there was a big expectation they're all going to be really in serious trouble. They're all going to be going to the IMF with a begging bowl. It hasn't happened. Why? Because they're not trading in dollars anymore. And interestingly, not that long ago, there's clear evidence that the countries in the global south, their currency is actually moving when the yuan appreciates because they're increasingly not trading in dollar terms. That's how big de-dollarization is. And they're actually now obviously finding they're not experiencing the problems they did when they had to use the dollar-based system. So there are overwhelming reasons why the West doesn't understand China and Russia. They think it's a marriage of convenience. They're going to stab each other in the back. And they talk about these border disputes, not understanding the border disputes were dealt with 20 plus years ago. They don't exist anymore. They only exist in the minds of those who are terrified of what Russia, China developments could be. And there are those in the US who are really worried about this. But it's long since gone from being a situation where they could affect any change. That relationship's unbreakable. And in essence, it's the backbone of multipolar world. It is the backbone of how the global south see those two countries and perceive them, that we now have someone who's fighting our corner and can protect us from the United States, because what's the US going to do? Have regime change in every country in the world? You can't do it. You can't pick off the small guy anymore as they used to in the past. There are obviously attempts to do so with color revolutions in, for example, Georgia and other places, Kazakhstan in recent years, Belarus, and the list goes on. But that's fundamentally, there's a lot of individual developments that are going on in financial terms. They've built a financial platform, the Chinese and the Russian. Eventually, the things will be integrated into BRICS, so they'll all so forget the BRICS currency. That's not on the cards because look at what the euro did for the European Union countries. It's not feasible till they marry up their economies. It's ridiculous. It's like putting Germany and Greece in the euro. What an absolutely idiotic
mm-hmm.
decision that was. So they're not going to repeat that mistake. But the big emphasis has always been local currencies. We build systems where we don't have to trade in Swift or anything to do with dollar denominated assets. And it's very clear that countries are moving away rapidly, and the amount of trade done in non-dollar terms is far bigger than the perception in the world is, or the world that believes it. And this is all on the back of China, Russia, and I'm not diminishing the role other countries are playing because they play a significant role, like all the Asian countries and how they trade with China, for example. But also, there's big developments happening between Russia and the Asian countries, and this all revolves, unsurprisingly, around energy because everyone wants cheap Russian energy, except the West, who don't want cheap Russian energy because of their ideological hatred of Russia. But ultimately, they're destroying their own economies and societies and their way of life. But that's the choice they made, and they have to live with it. But eventually, they're going to pay an enormous price in doing that.
Just looking at a map, and I'd advise people to have a look at a global map or just refamiliarize yourself. Number one, how big Russia is in terms of land area, it's phenomenal. And then looking at those borders, that's why my eyes were wandering when you were talking, Paul, because I was looking around the globe as you were speaking. So yeah, I'll take a screenshot of this and I'll put it in with the post. But have a look at a map of the world, and you realize that area in the east of Russia is, I don't want to say it's like no man's land, 'cause that's probably quite offensive to say that, but there's a lot of potential there, to say the least. Secondly, we'll get onto energy in a minute. I just want to go back to Georgia. And again, people, I would highly recommend you have a look at a map and look where Georgia is, and then look at that relation that it has with regards to its geography in relation to Iran, China, and Russia. But if we can, Paul, before we go on to the irony of Western energy, Georgia, let's talk a little bit more about that. And again, my knowledge on this is minimal, so I'm not going to pretend I'm an expert on this. But again, geographically located between Iran and obviously to the north of it, it has Russia. So why is Georgia so important? And secondly, what has been going on there and why? Feel free to dig in as much as you want.
Well, there's a kind of weird history to this where there was a war between Georgia and Russia in 2008, but they kind of got over that. It's one of those situations where this is a bit of a strange comment to make, but Russia fought a war whereby they didn't totally destroy relations between Georgia and Russia. That may sound a bit bizarre, but there are ways to fight a war and ways to fight a war. And so they've kind of, you know, got over that and moved forward. It would be hard to quantify Georgia as being pro-Russia as the way the West thinks it is. The West has a problem because it doesn't like the current government, Georgian Dream, who they perceive to be very pro-Russia, anti-West. They've made their point. Look, we want to be part of the European Union on our terms at some point in the future, but we're not anti-Russian and we don't want to have bad relations with them
Mhm.
because it's in mutually beneficial for our economies to work together. But of course, the West hates that. And it's in the Caucasus, so it's a bit of a politically hot potato region. Look at Georgia's relationship, geopolitical location in relation to Azerbaijan and Armenia, who've had, sort of a war not that long ago, and there's conflict between those two nations, and there's a simmering feud going on. They have a very complicated relationship, both of them, with Russia. But the West has always wanted, or the United States, to control the Caucasus because they think, therefore, that encompasses the Caspian Sea as well and the Black Sea on the other side. And it's a way of cutting off a land link between Russia and Iran, and the north-south trade corridor, which is a hugely under development, encompasses, of course, Russia and Iran. And therefore, they want to see all efforts to curtail any economic activity that benefits Iran. Obviously the story that Iran's been under sanctions for decades and the US is desperate because it doesn't want the current, what it terms, regime in government there. It's failed to achieve those objectives, and now Iran's a very different country than, given its military strength, which the United States discovered during that 12-day Iran-Israel war recently. So it's one of those areas where the United States wants to have those three countries in its back pocket. Doesn't want them trading or cooperating with Russia. And because, of course, they border with Iran as well. So one of those situations where the last couple of years, there's been numerous attempts to have so-called color revolutions to get rid of the existing government and put in a government they think is Western sympathetic, doesn't hates the Russians, and will sever all ties. But I mean, it's complicated in Georgia because you have those breakaway republics like South Ossetia, which is kind of another thing that will make rapprochement between the West and Georgia that much more complicated. So it's one of those regions where they will keep picking away, hoping eventually that they will get a Western sympathetic government. They can curtail all the obviously the economic developments and that's going on. But Georgia's very pragmatic and sensible. We can have a great relationship with the West, even though it's part of Europe. But in terms of joining the European Union, Russia doesn't care about that. But don't tell us who we can't. We can't trade with Russia and
Mm.
have the this kind of relationship we do with them. So that's why it's hugely significant and why they keep nibbling away and hoping. And recently there was a kind of bit of a muted attempt at another kind of color revolution that died very rapidly. But the thing is that the leadership of this Georgian Dream have been very vocal about it, saying what's actually going on there. But that's the reason. It's just if you look at it geographically, it's very important kind of node of the future of multipolarity. And it would take too long to discuss what the north-south trade corridor is. Maybe we can talk about that another time
Mhm.
in some more detail, but it's a major artery basically of the multipolar world, and it involves obviously countries like Afghanistan, Pakistan, etc. And that's why there's all this contention and flashpoints there in that region. It all ties in with keeping the US interests alive and not succumbing to multipolarity and obviously the risk of the enormous China Russia influence. I mean, there's the China Pakistan economic corridor that the US isn't very happy about. And there's all these other developments that and why this is just another part of this puzzle. So when you see things in Georgia, when you see the bigger picture, you can understand what's going on there.
I'll reference again people to have a look at a map of the Caucasus, as you say, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. Fun fact: I don't think I'm actually allowed in Armenia because I've got an Azeri stamp in my passport. So that's just thought I'd throw that out there for random information and knowledge. And also, if you have a look at the variety of enclaves that exist in Azerbaijan and Armenia because of those issues that you've gone into their pool with their recent history. Again, just fascinating to see it on a map, to be honest. So again, I'll take a screenshot, but people, I'd highly recommend you go and have a look at a map just so you can get a visual understanding of how important that corridor is. But what I'm thinking we should do, and I've just mentioned it, is let's have a quick look at the irony of energy in Europe, and then maybe let's just finish off with an American perspective, and we'll leave that there for this particular episode, and then we'll come back and go through other aspects. Looking at the EU, looking at the UK, I'm wondering, and I'd like to know what your thoughts are on this. Do people have an inability to put two and two together to make four, or because of maybe mainstream media, are people just so indoctrined into a certain way of thinking that they can't sort the wheat from the chaff, so to speak? And what I'm trying to reference is what you mentioned earlier on with energy prices. About, well, let's sanction Russia. Okay, well, Russia then goes and does some business with China, who then does business. And you mentioned the transport route and the costs involved, and not to mention that's not the most environmentally friendly route to take either. yeah, it seems as though people in the EU, in the UK, are not able to put this together, and I'm just wondering why that is the case, and how much of a role the media plays. Or that being said, if there are other forces in play, please do go into that as much as you can.
Well, of course, people largely believe the mainstream media perspective. People have a lot of ideological hatred of Russia, which is ingrained in them. There's people who grew up during the original Cold War and in certain European countries who were under Soviet occupation. They're now politicians, they're now leaders of countries, and they're just, I mean, ideologically brainwashed is true. I mean, but they just refuse to believe that Russia's anything other than this evil empire, Soviet Union 2.0 in the making. It's a combination of things. It's a combination of the fact that a lot of these politicians genuinely are fearful of Russia. They genuinely are of the mindset in like the Ukraine war that Russia is going to be defeated very quickly. We will destroy their economy because we'll sanction them, even though sanctions were never going to work. And I said the day the war started on it, on what was Twitter then, if they push through their sanctions, we as Europe will destroy ourselves. It won't affect Russia because of the fact that we don't understand how Russia operates. We thought we'll get rid of Putin because the people will revolt. Putin's never more popular in Russia than he's ever been. They don't understand the mindset of Russian people that when there's an existential threat, everybody backs the leader. Everybody supports what Russia's doing in Ukraine. Whether people agree doesn't matter. That's the statement of fact. They thought that the global south countries would all turn their back on Russia and they'd be economically isolated. And then ultimately, they thought, well, we'll balkanize Russia, we'll steal all their assets like we tried to do the fall of the Soviet Union during the Yeltsin era, and we'll prevail and we are going to win because that is the brainwashed mindset that we always win, we can't lose. Well, as I said on day one of the war, Russia can't lose because they're the biggest nuclear power in the world. And if they think they're really losing, they will use nuclear weapons. Does the West not understand what nuclear weapons mean? They don't. I think they genuinely go, Putin's a monster, but he's not monster enough to use nuclear weapons. Well, make your mind up to spot the contradiction there. So it's a combination of people believing things because they believe the mainstream media, and it's kind of just something, if you tell people something enough times, it becomes something they believe to be true. It's also the West totally has no understanding of Russia in any way, shape, or form. They don't understand China either in any way, shape, or form. So they came to all these conclusions, and then of course they're sat there now going, well, none of this panned out, but they still want to believe that Russia's going to lose. I mean, but they come out with these incredible contradictions that Russia's still losing the war, Russia's economy is collapsing, Ukraine's destroying all their refineries, which isn't true. But in the next breath, they're going, but they could still invade and take the whole of Europe, so we must arm ourselves like we've never had before to protect ourselves. What? Protect yourself from the country you've just told us is losing the war and is about to collapse, but people don't think. And I think part of the problem is people are not interested, don't have time, or just don't want to face the uncomfortable reality that perhaps they've been lied to. As we've been lied to in the West about too many things for far too long. So it's all those things in combination, but it ultimately comes back to the fact that they then clutch at straws and they're desperate now because privately they realize a number of factors. We've destroyed our own economies. We have bankrupted ourselves because we've got no money to spend. Hence, well, maybe we need to steal Russia's, reserves in the West that are frozen in like Euroclear, and the Belgians are going, no, you're not. It's against international law. Forget it. But oh, we'll steal the interest. Because they're out of options. They've got nothing to give. China's ban on rare earths means effectively the United States and European allies can't make any weapons anymore. So they're running out of weapons to give to Ukraine. There's no money. Ukraine's running out of people to fight the war because so many people have either been killed, very sadly, or they've deserted, or or they've just injured and incapacitated to the point they can never return to the battlefield. And the West goes, but Russia should have won the war in a week. They're losing because they're weak. No, it's a war of attrition. Russia
Mhm.
states its goals and everyone ignores them. They've said, we are here just to kill as many Ukrainian military as possible. We're here to destroy the apparatus we believe runs the country. This is their words. I'm only stating what they've said. We're not here to gain territory. We're here just to demilitarize it in totality. They've suddenly realized as well that they're demilitarizing Europe in the process, and NATO's collapsing as a result of this. And the US wants to walk away because it's so embarrassed, because it doesn't want to be seen to have presided over another Vietnam. Trump administration could have just had nothing to do with it, but now they're involved. And the last throw of the dice really is to say, well, we'll give Ukraine some Tomahawk missiles. Well, this all sounds very grandiose because all the other game changers failed. TACMs, Abrams tanks, you name it. They're all destroyed. What are the Tomahawks are old, antiquated missiles. They're very slow. The most they can give them is 50, and it's probably a lot less, but Ukraine can't launch them. It have to be launched by the Americans, and the Russians have said, well, if you do that, you're at war with us. Do you understand what being at war with us means? Because there's this belief in the West, oh, we'll have this conventional war with Russia, and we'll have a war like they did with Ukraine, and whoever comes out on top is the victor. No, what's simply going to happen is if you're sat there going, well, the other side might use nuclear weapons, Russia's going to go, we'll use them first. And we have better nuclear arsenal and we can shoot your missiles a lot more. We have more capability to shoot them out of the sky. So if there's a declaration of war in 15 minutes, Europe ceases to exist. Simple as that, across the board. There is no let's have pistols at dawn, duels, and all this kind of nonsense that
Mhm.
people imagine. So when they talk about World War III, they're so cavalier and blasé about it. We absolutely have to avoid World War III because that's the end of us in our existence. So there are all these things where, frankly, the caliber of people in Western politics and the advisors and the people pulling the strings is so bad that people go, they can't be that stupid. It must, and hence why they're deliberately destroying our economies. No, they're not. They're destroying all these things because they're so stupid. Because they thought we'll wipe out the pipelines and because it will destroy Russia. The war won't last long, and when Putin's gone and they're begging on their knees for rapprochement, we'll fix the pipelines and we'll get lots of cheap energy, and it'll all work out swimmingly. And then they went, oh, it's not working out how we thought. Um, for all the sanctions they put on, it's blowing up in the West's face all the time. So Germany's deindustrializing at a rate that means there's no hope for it. It's finished. And the rest of Europe's in big trouble. And it was irrespective. But for me, the Ukraine war was a massive accelerant of the destruction of everything, economically, financially. So as I say, that's the sort of 30,000-foot view and all the problems that we're seeing. But there's a lot more detail beyond that. But that gives the broad perspective that there are many facets to this. But as I always say at the end of the day, reality is going to play out. And if you don't accept reality, reality will crush you. And the West is being crushed by a reality it doesn't want to accept. And at some point, the Ukraine war will end. And hopefully, it ended 3.5 years ago, but it never did. And then when Russia doesn't invade the rest of Europe, and in a few years, people are going to turn around at some point and go, well, that never turned out how we were told. But people have very short memories because I'm old enough to remember Iraq and the weapons of mass destruction that never existed. We were told they did, and we
Mhm.
have to remove Saddam. They never think, are we being lied to again? Is it possible that what we're being told isn't the truth? No, they just believe it. Then in a few years, they'll find out something else was a pack of lies. And the most bizarre thing for me in the West is no one trusts governments, but they believe everything those governments tell them about China, about Russia, Iran, etc., etc. It's an incredible contradiction, but we as people are as much to blame for not looking at things and going, what could be really going on? And that's not me in any way, shape, or form condoning what happened in Ukraine. The war should never have happened. It is all wars are abhorrent. Anybody
Mhm.
dying is an appalling tragedy, whether they're on the battlefield or I hate using the term collateral damage, but people understand what I mean by that. But at the end of the day, the one thing I will say is I understand why Russia went to war. And that's something many people in the West don't understand. They should understand, but understanding it doesn't mean you agree with it. But if you understand why they did, then you know why this has happened, why it's an existential threat as far as Russia's concerned, and hence why we're back to the position Russia can never lose the war because if they think they are, they're going to press the nuclear option irrefutably. And privately in the US, they know this, which is why throughout the whole of the Ukraine war, they're forever getting on the hotline going, look, that we weren't involved in that. No, we know you didn't do that. They're desperate because they don't want a hot war with Russia because they know the sensible heads in the US, which there are some, that that's the end of the US. So why would you want to do that? Of course you wouldn't want to do that. So it's complicated, but the sad part is there's an element of it that's so ridiculous because people need in the West to understand what is, it can't be that difficult if you spend a bit of time to think about it. But as I say, I'm old enough to have known, I wasn't that old relatively, but and certainly this was more obviously in the 80s before the collapse of the Soviet Union. Uh, the mentality and the brainwashing and how the Russia's it's the old kind of better dead than red mentality but there's a lot of people who lived and I'm not saying the Soviet Union was not a nice place and their occupation of the Baltic republics wasn't a nice thing for these people. I understand, but at some point you have to let go and go, that's in the past. I have to move on because the world's changing, and at some point, Europe's going to have to end up normalizing relations with Russia. But we're so far away from that. But if they don't, the sad fact is they're doomed because they cannot afford to have hugely expensive oil and gas because our economies depend on it. And while you depend on it, everything ends up costing an awful lot more, which is why we have ridiculous inflation just in food prices. I know from where we live in Europe, food prices are ridiculous. I know in the UK, I get told by people how much they're now spending on their food bill alone
Mhm.
and this is all part of this problem because you know, if you have food you buy in the supermarket, it costs money to put it in the supermarket. You have to produce it, you have to bag it, you have to transport it. If everything costs more in energy terms, you're going to pay a lot more for that item you pick off the shelf or out the freezer section in a supermarket. It's as simple as that. And that's just one very small example of, and then factor that in industrially, and it just becomes an absolute nightmare. But if I can see it on day one of the Ukraine war, you put these sanctions in place, it won't affect Russia, but we will be destroyed. If I can see it, I don't see why other people can't see it, but that's because I have an objective, open mind. And, it's rather like I'm very critical of the US, but I'm critical because I'd like the US to be a great nation amongst equals. I'd like it to be a nation the world can look to and go, we can trust you, we can work with you because an American nation like that would be massively beneficial to the world, but more importantly, to the American people. But if you're going to sit there and just say everything's great, and I'm a patriot because I support America, well, I'm going to use a phrase that's like turkeys voting for Christmas. you're in essence going to cause your own destruction, your own demise as a country. You have to be critical where you should be, and if the American people were more critical and refuse to accept what their government does when their government's totally unreasonable, in the end, they will benefit enormously domestically, and the US will eventually, and it will one day, it might take a long time, be a nation that is respected because the global south has no respect for the US because they basically bulldoze the way around the world, behaving recklessly, irresponsibly, and evilly, and saying it's our way or the highway. And eventually that was not going to succeed. And now that empire is rapidly dying because the world has said, finally, and thank goodness it has, enough's enough. So, you know, but if you want change in a country, revolution isn't the answer. You have to change it peacefully. You have to change the mindset of people, and people need to start thinking more and saying, I don't like what I'm seeing. I don't want this anymore. But aggression, violence, wars, revolutions never solve anything. Never in history has there been a revolution that actually sorted a country out. It just doesn't work. But if people collectively say, I'm not voting for these people anymore, I want real politicians, I want real political parties who look after our best interests, then we can succeed. But until then, you just keep voting for the same people and expecting a different result. Well, that's the definition of insanity because you're not going to get a different result, which is why I've never voted in my life once. Because I knew at 18 these political parties don't stand for anyone. They stand for themselves or for bigger, interests,
Mm.
special interests, whatever you want to call them. And the day that changes, I'll vote for someone. But I don't see anywhere in the West we're even remotely close to having real political parties who actually do want to do the right thing for people. And a final point worth making, China's a one party state, and we hate the idea of that in the West. And I'm totally on board with that. But the Chinese government's done more for the Chinese people in the last 20 years than our governments have done for us in 200 years.
I think that's a very good place to wrap up for this part, Paul. I think there's a lot for people to go away and think about. I know that about 45% of listeners on the Contrarian Capitalist are from the USA, so I'm hoping that everyone can listen to this and form their own opinion and form their own reasons. Um, I think it's fair to say you have been very fair to every country that you've mentioned, good points and bad points. So I like to think we're not sat here, slandering various places and people. We're just saying it how it is. So I'd like to thank you for that. And yes, we will come back for round two. I don't know when that'll be. It'll be sooner rather than later because, of course, everything that you've spoken about, we can go more into depth into that, especially with regards to energy and, of course, gold, silver, and other things as well. So we'll make sure we do that in the second part. But that 30,000 foot view that you've given, I'd just like to say a thank you for that because I've been sat here and I've learned quite a few things as well. So I just want to say a massive thank you for going through that in such detail, Paul.
Well, no, it's a pleasure, and thank you for asking me to come on. And yeah, we can go into more detail and do things. And rather than rushing things, we'll just pick subjects and, we can build a picture over a period of time. I'm more than happy to do it. And, and I hope it will start to produce the picture that I'm seeing. I mean, and because it is a big picture and there's an awful lot of detail, but hopefully we've started to give ideas for people to go and think about things they might not have heard. They may have heard of a lot of it, some of it, or none of it, but hopefully it'll make people think a bit differently. But look, at the end of the day, I'm not a fan of any country or anything. But when I see some countries doing things that are far more in the interests of their people, I'm going to say it. Whether that is something people agree with or want to hear is irrelevant. It's a statement of fact, and China as a country, and we haven't discussed that, and that's something we could do a whole episode on. go to China yourself, see it with your own eyes, because I know plenty of people in the last 10 years who've gone and they've been completely shocked by it. They never expected it to be how it is as a development, and it's an eye opener. And that's why it's really important that people do go and see places, do assimilate into what the culture of countries are. Yeah, the Chinese are very different, but when you get to know them, and I have done, I've spent quite a lot of time there on and off over the years. It's a different, but they're great people and they're very keen to do business with us in the West. But if you're going to stab them in the back, forget it, because as the United States is starting to find, if you want to play dirty with them, they can dish out far more than you're going to give them. They're happy to roll in the mud, and as they've said, if you want a trade war, we'll fight the trade war to the bitter end, and they will do. And the West and the United States will regret the day they did it. And no one should underestimate the Chinese. For me, they're far more of a threat in inverted commas. I don't mean that literally, but for me, and I said this on X recently, Russia's a pussycat compared to China. And I really mean that. That might surprise a lot of people, but the Chinese are a lot less tolerant. But, that's something for another day. But thank you. Really appreciate you getting in touch and look forward to doing more in the future. And obviously, people can comment, they can get in touch with us. If you, and we're happy. You get a lot of emails, obviously, but, maybe some of the questions we can field in a future, podcast I do with you.
100%. I would encourage that feedback from anyone around the world about any subject, any topic. Please do get in touch, leave comments below. You can also get in touch with us on social media channels as well. Paul, I should say, because I always like to give everyone the chance to say how they can be found. Obviously, mentioned at the top the Sirius report. So I've got here, and that's Sirius for people that want the spelling of that. I've got on X, the Sirius report, obviously on Substack, the Sirius report, and on YouTube as well. I will link to all of those channels in the post on Substack and YouTube as well. But we do encourage feedback. We hope that you've enjoyed this. We will deep dive into more things moving forward. Paul, thank you again for your time and look forward to speaking again soon.
Yeah, thank you. And yes, very much so.